So thank you very much to all of you, speakers, of course, but also all of you who are joining this web conference of the Japan program at FRS. This will be a 2-hour conference in English on French and Japan visions of security challenges in the global commons, sea, space, and cyber. This is the original title of the conference. I will not take too long to elaborate on the burning actuality of these issues in the context of the war in Ukraine. We will it's a short conference, so I don't want to speak too much, but still, I would like to mention a few points. Suddenly, in the 21st century, we witness actually in the heart of Europe, a kind of return to a very traditional forms of war, including siege warfare, and at the same time, a combination of all the new domains that we will focus on. Maritime, space, and cyber domain are all affected by this war. Just recently, I read that paper on, for instance, what will happen with space station between the US and Russia, for instance. This is only one example. When we planned this conference, it was a few months ago, our web conference was intended to focus on the more global challenges related to this domain, on the threats to a liberal, value-based world order, including in the Indo-Pacific. And this is, of course, what our speakers will do, but indeed, it is also extremely timely, considering the situation, to exchange views and analyses between Japan and France, two countries that share the same values. In order to do that, we have 3 panels of excellent experts from Japan and from France. At the first panel on challenges in the maritime domain, we have Vice Admiral Koda Yoji with a long career in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces, and Marianne Perrondoise, a renowned expert on maritime security on Northeast Asia. She is currently Senior Research Fellow at IRSEM. The second panel on space challenges, we will have Professor Suzuki Kazuto from the Graduate School of Public Policy, University of Tokyo, and Xavier Pasco, our Director General at FRS, but also one of the most expert on space issues. And finally, on cyber, we will have Matsubara Miroko, Chief of Cyber Security at NTT Japan, and Nicola Mazzucchi, Senior Research Fellow at FRS, who are both particularly illuminating on all these issues related to cyber norms and cyber security. So without waiting more, I give the floor to Admiral Koda to open our first panel. Admiral Koda, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Valerie. Also, thank you, FRS, for providing this opportunity to me, especially in this very busy time. And since I have only 15 minutes, I think now only 14 minutes, yes, just as Valerie mentioned, let me touch shortly upon the situation in Ukraine. And to some extent, the Russian invasion, military invasion or aggression into Ukraine is a little surprising. Though there are so many indications in last 4 months, 6 month period, but really, the real beginning was, I would say, the end of the Cold War in 1990 or 1991. Then, the demise of Russia and Russia's economy and the military capability really went down and then started reviving. And President Putin, they took his power. And then gradually, the Russia started regaining or taking their national capability to influence and play in international arena back gradually. And then, the President Putin, supported by a kind of the revived Russian economy and the military capability, started claiming strongly against the current border or demarcation between the present NATO and the Russian territory. And say the first landmark was 2008, the invasion and annexation of the Georgia, and then 2014, the annexation, occupation of the Crimea. And then this time. But this time, there are, I think, several things we need to pay attention. One is Putin started for the first time in human history as a national leader of the big country with the nuclear. He started mentioning the use of the nuclear power against not only the United States, another nuclear power, but also the NATO nations, non-nuclear powers. And this is really a scary the political maneuver, and makes the situation much more complicated. Then Putin set a clear role, the objectives, non-expansion of the NATO, or taking the nuclear out of NATO, and the preventing the Ukraine from joining the NATO. But at the same time, based on his statement in the past 4 months or 6 months, it's clear that he had no intention to make any compromise with the US, including NATO and the US. So it's a kind of the result of the natural stream of the flow of the tide. The war was inevitable. And then he started invading into. And so, I think other people will say many things over this Ukraine situation. So I'll stop here. But from the maritime perspective, there are several things we need to consider. One is the naval role in the conflict or aggression is not large, but at least Russian military deployed its naval forces and taking some forces from Northern Fleet and also even from the Pac Fleet. And the role of their large cruisers were, checking the US carrier forces in Mediterranean and also providing the small sized landing capability of the ground forces into the coastal area of Ukraine. And of course, this is not a main show, a side show. This is simply the side show, but still has some effect to make the defense of the Ukraine more difficult and situation more complicated. And one more thing is the role of Turkey. The Ukraine is the coastal nation of the Black Sea, and Black Sea is a very special the water. And the only exit is the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Strait, and that Turkey controls those two straits. And for the time being, Turkey blocked or closed the passage of the combat ships in and out to the Black Sea. So now this makes the US response a little difficult, but also, the Russia is facing some problems because the communication between Black Sea and their forces, 30 ships forces in Mediterranean, and also some supplies from Mediterraneans are stopped. So this is one of the features of the Ukraine situations through the lens of the maritime theater. And now let me start using my slide and speak something over the Indo-Pacific situations. I think, can you see my slides? Okay.
Yes, Admiral, we can see your slides, yes.
Okay, yeah, the first major subject is the Chinese maneuver. But today, since my time is limited, let me make my assessment over some of the characteristics of the Chinese forces or the Western forces. One is China is really the geographically constrained nation. Like Soviet or like Russian Empire and Soviet and today's Soviet and Russian the Federation, they did not have non-frozen port. But today's China, similarly, they do not have any open port for outer oceans. They are surrounded by two semi-closed seas, East China Sea and South China Sea. And for China to go in and to go out from China to outer ocean is surrounded by so-called First Island Chain. And First Island Chain is a kind of the chain of the choke points that really controls Chinese maritime shipping or even the overflights. And especially in South China Sea, there are only 3 choke points deep enough for Chinese submarines to go out or to come back. One is Bashi Strait here, Taiwan, Philippines, and another one is the south of Mindanao Island of the Philippines. And the third is Lombok Strait. And those 2 other straits, Malacca and Sunda Straits, these are the world famous, the channels for the maritime the commerce, but they are too shallow, only 22 meters in depth. So submarines cannot go out or go in. And even the large ships have some difficulties to pass through in water. And for China, especially the Chinese naval forces, sorting out from Sanya base in Hainan Island to go out the Pacific Ocean or to the Indian Ocean, they have to pass those 3 points, or from the East China Sea to the chain of Okinawa, that under Japanese control. So this is one thing. When we consider Chinese naval strategy, we need to take into account. Second, fourth, Americans started saying, especially the US Navy, last year started saying by hull number, the number of the Chinese ships. China is already the world's largest navy. Yes, that is correct. But how about the capability? The map, very busy map, is the first comparison map provided by US Indo-PACOM last year. And of course, it's too busy. This picture is too busy, so sorry for you, you can't read. So I made some in the paperwork to make those pictures or the paintings into the numbers. So this is the force strength by number represented in the previous picture. And China, okay, in that picture, for example, Chinese fighter is overwhelming over the US forces in this region. Bomber 175-0, maritime patrol aircraft 15-5, carrier 3-1, amphib ships 12 and 4, and big ships, big destroyers 112, and submarines 64-10, and medium range missiles, short range missiles, US 0. China has many, and satellite. Yeah, pretty even. Okay, then, but this is not the real capability, because US only explains the force strength that are deployed only in Korea and Japan. So I'm not saying US is telling a lie, but we need to be fair enough to really count the real capability of the US forces. I'm not the advocate of the US forces or advertisement and the agency of the United States, but I'm talking from the fair point. Just please take a look at the second picture. Okay, the fighter, the real number, counting the US fighters deployed in mainland, 2,400. And the bomber, you can see all of these figures. So now this is the real strength of force when we think about US-China competition in Asia. And my last word is please take one moment to look at the missile forces. You know, the second line from the bottom, say Chinese missile force, okay, 300 medium-range missile aiming Japan, 400 short-range missile aiming Japan, and 900 aiming Taiwan. But US, really, this is the reality, 0. This is why the US started emphasizing the importance of the medium missile forces. That is lacking today for the US forces. All the other forces, US is still overwhelmingly stronger than China. And this is the kind of the force strength we need to take into account. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating and extremely interesting. And can you, now I will give immediately the floor to Marianne Perrondoise to follow up for 15 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Valerie.
Maybe we,
yeah.
Can you take off your screen?
I will let you, yes, to clean the screen, but in the meantime, I can say hello to everybody. I can say good evening, good good morning.
I'll close. How about this? Okay.
Yes, it's better. So now we will see Marianne, maybe.
Okay, my video is on, so
yes,
I guess
we can see you and you can start. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Valerie. First of all, my best greetings to everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending the time zone. Really, Valerie, thank you to you and to the FRS for inviting me to this traditional annual speaking events. I'm very glad to be there, even if, as you mentioned, we are speaking of maritime strategy in a very gloomy environment in Europe. Coming to my subject, in fact, I will deal with it by giving you a kind of panorama of the maritime challenge that we are facing, Japan, France, including EU, in the Indo-Pacific. Mention how we are already cooperating to, I will say, to face this challenge. And of course, I will also provide some thought regarding the current situation in Ukraine. And how we can link this situation by many aspects to the maritime challenge and good order at sea in the Indo-Pacific. So first of all, a few elements of context. Just to say that the maritime challenge of the Indo-Pacific are very numerous. And they vary greatly depending, of course, on the region. It is a very vast body of water, and we had very different maritime regions dealing with very different challenges at sea. When you consider the Indian Ocean, when you consider the China Seas, if I can put it like that, and when you consider these very vast areas, the Pacific, and you know that France is a neighboring country in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and is very keen to develop its cooperation in Oceania with Japan. And so what I can say is that there are many coastal states that depending of the sea in the Indo-Pacific, and this dependence is very variable depending of the geography. And I would like to emphasize something quite obvious for Japan. There are very numerous islands of very different size in the Indo-Pacific, If we consider, for example, Australia, which is a continental island, and Tonga, for example, there are very different, I would say, challenge and vulnerability related to the sea, considering these two states. Tonga, for example, is made of 3 archipelagos and of about 170 islands. And for example, when you consider the presence of France in the Indo-Pacific, this is an island presence. The French presence is made of islands in the Indo-Pacific. This can be from the, you see, from the metropole perspective, a surprise. And we had, you see, endlessly to emphasize and point out this fact that the main presence of France in the Indo-Pacific is around the island of La Réunion, for example, in the Indian Ocean, and the Polynesian Islands and New Caledonia in the South Pacific. A second element that is linked to the strategic interests apart from geography, the nature of the strategic interests that the sea represents for certain states and their capacity to invest in a navy and to develop a maritime strategy are very important in the maritime challenge of the Indo-Pacific. For example, you have India, that is a naval power and that has heavily invested in its navy, as a nuclear submarine component, for example. India has a dominant position, and of course, the existence of its resource made it a very active maritime actor, a very active maritime power, for example. India is very involved in the security of the Indian Ocean. India wants to be seen as a maritime security provider. Then after this very quick element of contextualization regarding the importance of the maritime fact of the Indo-Pacific, let us see and let us face and evocate briefly a panorama by major maritime zone of the main security challenges. In the Indian Ocean, for example, which was a scene of a very active piracy from 2008 to 2012, we are now witnessing development of crime at sea with drug, arms, and human trafficking. In addition, we had to face illegal fishing, climate change, and these two elements are growing constant for coastal states because they want to take advantage of the blue economy and to take advantage of the resource that come from the sea. And of course, to this element, we can add the destabilizing impact of the war in Yemen, and of course, the power rivalries between India and China with the development of the maritime Silk Road along the Indian Ocean coast from the Bay of Bengal, of course, and to the East African coast. In the south, in Southeast Asia, the regional maritime security is threatened also by persistent piracy. Can add also maritime terrorism risk due to the existence of criminal groups, sometimes linked to radical Islamist movement. But of course, the biggest security challenge in the area is a growing tension over maritime borders and China unilateral expansion, which does not take into account the legitimate right of some of its neighbors to exploit their maritime domain and to benefit as they see fit from the fish, oil, and gas resources of their exclusive economic zone. And this is particularly difficult for Vietnam, for the Philippines, for Malaysia, which are confronted with the continuous aggression of Chinese Coast Guard vessels, which is coordinated with the action of Chinese fishing vessels and maritime militia. Going now, having a brief look at East China Sea, this sub-maritime region is experiencing a similar situation of more or less intense tension over maritime claims to the sovereignty of several islands. Senkaku Island between China and Japan, Northern Territory between Japan and China, and finally, of course, Taiwan, which is quite an emblematic and very well-known case whose existing and democratic regime China does not recognize and which it intends to reunify even by forces. And to finish, the South Pacific part of Indian Ocean, which is particularly vulnerable due to the impact of climate change on its marine environment, including rising sea levels, ocean acidity, and other phenomena that threaten biodiversity. And as we all know, natural phenomena are particularly violent. Furthermore, illegal fishing is a scourge for these countries, which do not have the means to control and to protect their economic, as their exclusive economic zone without the help of their big neighbors, Australia, France, and the United States. And these maritime challenges, these maritime risk and threat are very well known to France and Japan, which are both Indian Pacific littoral states and are therefore facing this threat. And I would like to mention and to point out, pinpoint two of them because they seem to me to be emblematic of this area. Tension over sovereignty, right, and climate change. Because in my view, they are quite interesting to assess. The tension over maritime border are increasing in the region, and in many cases result for non-compliance with international law, and notably the Montego Bay Convention. And both Japan and France share a vision of an international order governed by law and multilateralism. Both depend on the sea because of the importance of maritime flows and shipping for international trade, and they cannot allow the development of gray zone at sea. The Montego Bay Convention must be applied. And the paradox is that it is on the basis of the BA's reading of the Montego Bay Convention and the status of islands that some country, China to mention it explicitly, is expanding its territory in the South China Sea by means of a strategy of fait accompli and the use of forces. The second challenge is very interesting, of course, because climate change and its impact on the sea and ocean are a priority and a specific focus for France in its Indo-Pacific strategy, and also for EU. And the fact is that we need to take more maybe into account the impact of climate change on the maritime security of states in the Indo-Pacific, because this is mainly the result of the lack of means, of capabilities, and also maybe the result of, I will say, a weak cooperation between littoral states. And France, as already mentioned, attach a great importance to this challenge, which figure prominently in the Indo-Pacific. And the security consequences are very important from the point of view of human security. I have in mind food security, immigration, and we all know that human security is a very important concept in Japan's conception of international relations. And so the two countries, France and Japan, can thus usefully cooperate to set up risk prevention policies, but also in the event of a disaster, to participate in humanitarian assistance operation coordinated with other partners. Quad, for example, often organize training exercise such as HADR, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operation. And this challenge, which are in the realm of traditional and non-traditional security threats, concern both France and Japan, which are mobilizing a range of resources together with the European Union, which has decided to launch its Indo-Pacific strategy in September 2021, to respond to them and to preserve their strategic interest. And this securing of common maritime space is first and foremost a matter of free access to this common space. And this, of course, will need a more regular presence of naval units and the organization of joint exercise and training. And of course, France can rely on EU naval presence in the Indo-Pacific and also may coordinate with the maritime presence, even irregular, of German, Italian, and Spain Navy. To finish, Valérie, because I see that I am reaching the end of my, 15 minutes allocation. So as this description tell us when we transpose the war in Ukraine and the maritime challenge of the Indo-Pacific. In my reading, and this is my reading, it is a transposition of the scenario of the use of force and aggression to existing situation of maritime tension that may worry some ASEAN countries. And this has already been mentioned by Admiral Koda in a way. And not surprisingly, this situation are known to the international community. This includes the China Sea, the South China Sea, with Beijing rejection of the Hague Tribunal arbitration since 2016, the hardening Sino-Japanese tension over the Senkaku Island, and even more, the perspective of the Beijing takeover of Taiwan. And it is understandable that with this example in mind, most Indo-Pacific countries are finding very difficult to position themselves within, whether it is against the aggressor, Russia, or against or in relation with the Western country, the United States and the European Union, which has decided to set up a very dissuasive response in order to stop the war and to bring Russia to the dialogue. And in fact, it is clear in my understanding that some are very afraid of sending the wrong signal to China by taking a too clear position, for example, by condemning explicitly the Russian aggression or by joining the sanctions put in place by the US and the EU. And I will stop there, Valérie, to let the floor to the following speakers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marianne. As for, yes, you're right about the positions of many countries in Asia, hesitating about what decision to make. But I must say that one of the most important points that we can witness is the fact that Japan, for instance, has been following very strictly all the sanctions measures adopted by the international community of the free world, to use a term that is very back in use these days. So now I will switch to the second panel, focusing on on challenges in space. And I will first give the floor to Kazuto Suzuki, again for 15 minutes. And please, this is to the participants and audience. Do not hesitate to put your comments or questions with the Q&A button. Without maybe waiting the end of all presentations, as we will have a very brief time for Q&A after the 6th presentation. Thank you very much. So Suzuki-san, the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you very much, Valérie-san, and thank you very much for Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique for organizing this event. My name is Kazuto Suzuki, and my background is a Grand Hotel in Vienna, which is home of the Iran nuclear deal. This is where the other things of, apart from the Ukraine, there's other things going on, which is the renegotiation of the Iran nuclear deal. And I was a member of the panel of experts on the sanctions on Iran. So this is something that I'm looking at the same time. But today I'm talking about the space challenges and the space issues in space challenges of around Japan. So let me just start using my slides, and then I'll explain, start from the background of Japanese security space. Perhaps many of you may know that Japan was hindered to engage in the space policy, the military use of space, and there was a strong focus on the R&D because Japan was the sort of a latecomer after the the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA. The forerunner of JAXA is called the NASA. NASA was created in 1969 when United States landed on the moon. And this 1969 was also a very historical date for Japan or Japanese space, that the Diet, the Japanese parliament, has made a resolution unanimously decided to make a peaceful use of space, which means that no investment by the military forces, and there is no military application of military use of space. So that means the Ministry of Defense and self-defense forces were not allowed to use space-derived services, including for weather forecast or satellite TV, etc. And that has changed in 1985 when Japan, the Diet allowed, the cabinet allowed to the self-defense force to access for the commercially available services, but still Japanese government have prevented or renounced from investing in space. So there was no military space activities until 2008. And also there was a 1990, the Japan-US Accord on the satellite procurement that has put Japanese industry more on the R&D rather than the commercial application, because this was a time of the Japan-US trade friction, and the United States put the political pressure on Japan to open up its satellite procurement market. So the public procurement of the satellite has to be open. Therefore, the United States will be able to penetrate into a Japanese market. Of course, the United States have more competitive space industry. But under these circumstances, Japan had a very strong focus on the R&D, and the JAXA was the center of it. But these are gradually changing because of the changing nature of the security around Japan. Perhaps one of the most outstanding date of that was the 1998 when the North Korea launched the Taepodong, which is the intercontinental ballistic missile, but it was told that it was a satellite launch. But the point was that Taepodong flew over Japanese territory and splashed into a Pacific Ocean, which means that the North Korea will have a missile capabilities which attacks Japan. So this was a time that the Japan started to seriously investigate and invest in the missile defense system. And also Japan acquired the information gathering satellite, which are almost likely that it's a spy satellite, but it was controlled under the cabinet, and it was considered not a military, but for the multi-purpose satellite because of the Diet resolution in 1969. And because of the experience of the information gathering satellite, which was not designated as the military satellite, the Japanese politicians find it's very frustrating that the Japanese space cannot be used for the military purposes. So for many other reasons, one of those reasons was to change the direction of the Japanese space investment in for the more open up for the military purposes. 2008, there was establishment of the Basic Space Law. Basic Space Law allows military application for the security of for the national security and the international security and peace. But also this Basic Space Law opens up for the commercialization and industrial policies. So it opens up for the other space ventures, and the government assist for the commercialization of space activities. So again, the Japanese space programs have challenges in itself on the use of the security purposes. But after 2008, there was a gradual opening and applications for the military purpose, and it matched up with its strategic objectives. And I think one of the key strategic concepts in Japan is a free and open Indo-Pacific, or what we call FOIP. Perhaps this was a little bit touched upon in the previous panel, that this is creates the sphere of Indo-Pacific as free and open, which means that there will be the core of the FOIP is the coalition of like-minded countries, particularly something called Quad, the Japan, US, Australia, and India, the 4 countries association, and to create some sort of a collective actions for the various issues, including the resilience of supply chain, but also for the use of space among the 4 countries to establish the rule-based governance in space. And particularly the formation of the rule-based international order through the setting up to have a group of countries, the Quad countries, forming the sort of a group to negotiate in the open-ended working group, which are now currently, which will be open in May this year, hopefully, and also the Quad countries will provide the regional stability by providing the satellite capabilities for not only the security issues, but also the resilience for the natural disaster. Today, there was a serious flood issues in Australia. Japan and US is now supplying the satellite images for Australia for the rescues and the reconstruction. And these intergovernmental coalitions and corporations is providing the opportunities for the further configuration of the Quad countries. And even though this is a sort of an open secret, the Quad is basically a group of states which is in competition against China. So it's not just a competition in the supply chains or the development and production of vaccines, but also it is a group that is working together for the for space cooperation, particularly for the military security purpose space, which is focused on the space situational awareness. So the Japan's activity in space, particularly for the military and security purposes, from the Japan, even though it kept away from the military use of space for many years, the current changing situation is opening up for the Japan's MOD, the Ministry of Defense, to engage into space activities. And particular focus is placed on the space situational awareness, SSA, and currently the Ministry of Defense is building the SSA radar in Yamaguchi Prefecture, and to monitor the movement of space debris and space objects, including the hostile space objects such as Chinese satellites. And the National Defense Program Guidelines in 2018 has put space as one of the major focus of the improvement of the defense programs. So space becomes as a center of the attention, and we are now in the process of writing the new National Defense Program Guidelines, as well as the National Security Strategy, by the end of this year. So space will be the center of this this new national security strategy, and there are lots of discussions going on. What sort of programs should be placed into this security strategy, and one of which is the setting the rules through the national regulations. The Cabinet Office, the agency responsible for the setting up the regulations for the space activities of the private and public activities. The Cabinet Office is setting up the guideline for on-orbit servicing, and this is this will be presented the open-ended working group under the UN General Assembly resolution, which will start from May this year. And this is the guidelines for on-orbit servicing, which means that the satellite servicing for the dead satellite and taking out the space debris. So the Japanese company called Astroscale is now doing the commercial services for taking out the space debris. But this space debris removal is also being considered as a space weapon, because you can take out the operational satellite of the other countries. So the key question for these guidelines is to ensure that there will be a transparency, providing information and make sure that everyone understands that this activity is not hostile. It will be used for only the purpose of taking out the debris. And national regulations is for granting licenses is the important demonstration that the Japanese government is committed not to use this technology for the military purpose, but for the goods of the state, goods of the international environment. So finally, just touching upon what is happening in Ukraine, the current warfare is very. There was a certain expectation that Russia is going to use the counter space capabilities to block and interfere the activities from space. For example, the American GPS or the American spy satellites or European communication satellites. None of that is yet to happen. However, Russia has tested ASAT, the kinetic destruction of its own satellite in November 2021, which was when Russia was preparing to invade Ukraine. So I think this ASAT test was a sort of a harbinger or some sort of a message that if there is a military intervention, then Russia will use the ASAT capabilities to take out the American or the NATO satellites. And this also tells us that the deterrence on the ground may extend to the deterrence in space. Therefore, Russia is not exercising this ASAT capability today. And also, what is happening in Ukraine is a demonstration that there is an effectiveness of the collective action among European states with G7 states will have the certain impact for economic sanctions and some other pressure on Russia. And finally, Japan's major security concern in space is the Chinese counter space capabilities. The Chinese ASAT test exercised in 2007, and China also have the capabilities of non-kinetic counter space capabilities. And therefore, the Japanese government is now putting the concept of mission assurance, which means that if there is interference and the destruction of the services or mission of the Japanese space capabilities, then we'll be able to back up or use the capabilities of the commercial capabilities or the capabilities of allies to continue the mission so that the mission is assured. And this, we are now conducting the couple tabletop exercises for make sure that these missions will be assured, and therefore we will be able to prepare for the possible use of the Chinese counter space capabilities. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. And yeah, a lot of food for thought in what you said, and especially the last mention of, you know, the backup of necessity to think about in advance on all these things, because we learned that strategic surprise is always there to fall on us. So now I will switch to the last and third round table with the two presenters, and I will, which will be the round.
What about Xavier?
I don't want to hear.
Sorry. I'm sorry,
it's okay.
Xavier. He's my director.
I know this.
Sorry, I was so engrossed in Kazuto's presentation. So sorry, Xavier.
No, but
the floor is yours.
Kazuto, as usual, has been very complete, and it's obviously always a pleasing challenge to follow up after Kazuto have a very good remarks. I just wanted, and I will be rather quick given all the level of information. I just wanted to give an overview of the challenges we have in space, completing what Kazuto has said, and often going back to what he said, just to give a picture of where we are today, and then see how we can focus on several challenges, but very quickly. So if we look back from now to the past 2 decades, we have seen a number of incredible changes in the space activity. And if we take a snapshot of today, and we can, this is a way to question the situation today, we can see 3 areas in which we have a high level of dynamism of change. And then in which we have also recently, we have seen the expression of competition of powers. We have the human exploration aspect area, which has transformed since the Apollo era into something much more, I would say, complete in terms of what we're going to do in space. You know, we're going from the space station now that exists to what's called the cislunar space. You know, the moon has taken the lead in this new redeployment of activities, and this is not only for space buffs. This has some strategic significance. And by the way, you have seen, and I will go back to this later on, the head of the Russian Space Agency at some point threatened to interrupt the space station, for example, from functioning, because it would seize the use of the Progress ship to boost the station. And so there has been already some exchanges around this, and beyond that, we see China getting more and more interested in going into these areas, and I will go back to this. So this is the first area where we see a lot of changes. The second area, of course, is the evolution of the satellite activities. We're talking not about single objects today. We're talking about thousands and tens of thousands of objects, and maybe at the end of the decade, 100,000 of objects circling the Earth. And of course, this is creating a complete new environment. This is forcing people having a different look at space. And by the way, this is inviting new communities in getting interested in space, and the link between space and the information technologies has become the center of a number of also of competition in space. So space is seen as an infrastructure, it's seen as a commodity. This is something that we see more and more and this is changing the whole space landscape. And the third area, of course, is the militarization of space. It's been mentioned by Kazuto. We have seen since 2007 with the resumption of asset tests by China. Since 2007, we have had 3 or 4 attempts of and experiments, asset experiments, and the last one being the Russian one in November last year, destroying a satellite, so creating debris. And as Kazuto mentioned, we can almost relate this expression of force to what we see today in Ukraine at some point. By the way, the debris that have been created by this particular asset test have been seen since as a real obstacle for an efficient use of space at some level. So it already has some physical effects on the way we're using space, and especially on the low Earth orbit. So that's important. So all these 3 areas, we see in all these 3 areas cross-cutting elements cutting across these areas. First, this evolution in all these 3 areas derived from a new way to use space and to inhibit space. We have more objects, more active technologies, allow maneuvers, much more efficient maneuvers, on-orbit servicing, Kazuto mentioned that, increase in logistics aspects of space. And this is very, very new. And so it's creating more uncertainties in space. More objects oblige you to question yourself on how you're going to manage this new environment, how you're going to coexist. So this is one thing. And it has legal, political, and even industrial dimensions to it. And of course, it is the object of national strategies, and it might be the object of a power confrontation in a sense. We're talking about exploitation even of extraterrestrial resources. We're talking about lunar and cislunar coexistence. We have, for example, the Artemis Accords that have been devised by the US and attracting countries, but there is a competing project of China International Lunar Base, for example. So all this is creating, I would say, new dynamics in this field with very closely attached to it, military aspect and security aspect. We see a number of reports about how to protect the cislunar environment now. This is new, you couldn't see those reports 10 years ago. This is the first thing, cutting across all these areas, you know, exploration, satellite infrastructures, and of course, militarization. The second thing, of course, cutting across this area is the ever-increasing role of China. It's clearly perceived by the US as the peer competitor for around 2025 in space. Clearly, even today, if you look at the statistics about launching, for example, in 2021, China has been the first launching nation with 56 space launches. It's more than 1 launch per week, which is impressive. And the United States were not far. I mean, they were 45. But it's interesting because between 5 years ago and now, the number of launches have almost doubled worldwide, which is a very significant aspect. Still, the US lead the pack in terms of tons in orbit and all this, in terms of number of satellites, because they launch a huge number of small satellites. Still, China is very active as well, and much far from this. Europe has not reached this kind of levels. So these 2 countries are really leading the activities regarding the level of activities and all this in all these categories. And so, of course, militarization, the third area. Yes, more and more we're talking about space deterrence. There is an increased level of military activities in space. We see, I told you about these assets. We see more and more maneuvers, what's called unfriendly RPOs, rendezvous and proximity operations. This is something that is more and more frequent. It's linked, so all this is linked to the combined effect of an increasing dependency of the military on space assets. And at the same time, this environment is getting more and more complex and less predictable. And this has created in a number of spacefaring nations and in the first place, and the US and Europe, but also in China, for example, the need for reorganizing and for, in fact, creating new situations and put themselves in a situation to act in space, which is very, very new. For decades, space has been oriented towards terrestrial use, I would say, and space was just a support to military operations on the ground. And what we see today developing, and it's quite worrying, are doctrines and I would say military thinking about acting in space in order to protect satellites, in order also to establish a military relationship, a military, I would say, posture in the space domain, in the orbital domain. So all this, you know, this ever-increasing dependency, as well as the environment getting more and more complex and less predictable, it's producing some sort of a shearing effect. And it has prompted, of course, this new space commands, space forces in the US, etc. And we see also the multiplication of war games, simulations, more and more. And you may have heard that a few days ago, France also organized its own Asterix 2022 space situation war game. And these are things that really show how much the dynamics in space has made simulation, new doctrines, new ways of using space, even for the military, something that's becoming compulsory in better reflecting. And of course, all this poses the question of knowing the environment. And this goes back to what Kazuto was mentioning, the space situational awareness capability. You know, the more you have objects, the smaller are these objects, the more SSA capacities you need to identify these objects, to identify the debris. So you have to face with risks, with possibly threats, etc. And you have to first get your own national capacities, and also, maybe more importantly, organize cooperation and the sharing of information. And it can really create some converging interests between countries. And for sure, Japan, for example, Europe, the United States, and some others have clearly common challenges to address here. So, of course, in all these three areas, this mounting power game has resulted in the need for new rules and what's called new norms of behavior. And also Kazuto touched upon this aspect earlier. For a few years, we have seen that translating, we have seen this appeal for new rules translating into, in fact, competing projects, especially at the level of the First Committee of the United Nations, at the Disarmament and International Security level, at the CD level in Geneva. There has been very early on, since I would say 2008, clearly two visions confronting each other. One vision by China and Russia asking for, I would say, renewing or creating a new treaty, a new legally binding instrument related to these aspects. And on the other hand, the United States and also Europe, which had this Code of Conduct project, which went nowhere, but which was intended to rather insist on a non-legally binding instrument to make sure that it can embrace a large, I would say, support from different countries. This, I would say that basically from then on, the dialogue has been very difficult between these two aspects, especially the legally binding initiative pushed by Russia, by China, especially by China with the support of Russia, was deemed insufficient to take into account all kinds of security issues in space. And by the way, it would not have regulated the Assad test performed by ground-based missiles, for example. And there's also this question of verification. All these things have been opposed by the US as showstoppers for accepting this kind of treaty. And so they wanted to insist more on the I would say, progressive, non-legally binding regime that would help create, I would say, some sort of political communication. Anyway, this has been frozen for years. I must say that recently, I think some progresses have been made, and we will, of course, we cross finger in the current situation, but especially under the leadership of the UK, a first resolution has been proposed to reduce threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, and this has managed to garner sufficient support from a number of countries, leading today to what also Kazuto mentioned, which was the open-ended working groups. That's going to be started, yes, hopefully, let's cross fingers, in May this year, and will go on in 2023. We see what it means. It's, in my perspective, it looks like there is a will, possible will on both sides to reconcile two perspectives by proposing a step-by-step approach, maybe starting with non-legally binding stuff, and then ending up in the end on more legally binding thing. Anyway, I will not be long, Valerie. Now I just want to give you some elements that seems to be to create some sort of collective agreement potentially. For example, about a ban on kinetic energy interceptions, creating debris, and this is something that more and more is considered widely as something that should be absolutely avoided, and this is certainly something we're going to see rising in terms of debates at the UN level. There's this notion of deconflicting and de-escalating, so which goes to the transparency and necessity, which goes back to the SSA capacity and capability of countries to exchange information. And certainly, and this is in my view, this transparency is certainly the key challenge. We have to invent, certainly, and we discussed that before with Kazuto earlier today, if I may, a new creative platform for exchanging data in this area. And there's going to be a very, very key to keep space safe and sustainable. We have maybe reached the point where we have to take into account this advanced in military activities, the fact that indeed countries have developed weapons to protect their satellites, but then we have to do it responsibly, and we have to create this kind of maybe initiative, taking this into account, but then making necessary a complete new way of exchanging data and creating transparency in space. So we stop there, and of course we will have questions afterwards, I guess. Thank you, Valérie.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Of course, all the questions all the issues you raised at the end of your presentation, it comes to my mind. So, what will we be able to do with Russia, for instance, in the situation we are here now, and with China, of course. But yeah, how do you engage with a country that is completely focused on other issues and with different values? But now this is our third panel and last one for this conference between the Q&A. And I will first give the floor to Miroku Matsubara. This is a panel on cyberspace. So please, Miroku, the floor is yours for 15 minutes. Again, for the participants, do not hesitate to put your questions or comments with the Q&A button. Thank you very much, Miroku. We listen to you.
Thank you, Valerie, for having me today. So I'd like to talk about Ukraine-Russia situations, how it has changed our cyber challenges in the 21st century. So even before these aggressions had started, we had been really worried about how Russia would play out its hybrid warfare against Ukraine. And we had some potential scenarios we would see after Russia's aggressions. So there will be the two scenarios of direct cyber threats to Ukraine and indirect threat to the rest of the world. So we would have imagined that the cyber warfare or hybrid warfare would include massive disruptions caused by cyber attacks against Ukrainian critical infrastructure, such as communication, electricity, financial, and transportations to disrupt the Ukraine's military operations and also cause a panic. That's what we've seen in the 2014 hybrid warfare by Russia. And we had been also really worried about what if following the aggressions, the world imposes economic sanctions on Russia, and what if Russia would resort to retaliatory cyber attacks against financial institutions in European, American, or Japanese sectors. But it would be then also like a supply chain attack by Russia if Russia would attack a company that produces the widely available products or services. Then ransomware attack or wiper disruptive cyber attacks would stop the supply of such products or services. So we would see the domino effects by one cyber attack from one country to other countries. So we had been really worried about now what kind of scenario that Russia would resort to. But for some reason, we have not seen much aggressive, disruptive nature of cyber attacks so far. So I'd like to talk about the potential reasons why we haven't seen such aggressive, disruptive nature of cyber attacks yet. But what we've seen so far and what really surprised us so far is various non-governmental hacker groups have participated in this situation, such as Anonymous, Cyber Partisan from Belarus, Conti ransomware group, and Ukraine IT army. And of course, whenever geopolitical tension raises, we see hackers become more active to launch cyber attacks. But we had never seen such a wider variety of hacker groups from different countries actively declare why they are participating in this situation and what they are attacking. So far, their cyber attacks are mostly limited to website defacement, such as posting anonymous logos or patriotic Ukrainian songs on Russian media websites, or DDoS attacks to bring down the websites of Russian government or media. But because this is not only happening in cyberspace, this is also happening in parallel to the physical world war, and it's really emotional, and people are dying, and the facilities, including schools and hospitals, have been destroyed. So because cyber attacks can be anonymized, and also it's really hard to see who's doing what. So because the variety of the actors to participate in this cyber warfare or hybrid warfare might really make it easy to escalate tensions and also the aggressiveness of cyber attacks in cyberspace. So we have to be very careful to see what will happen next. And because we've seen multiple times that Russia had resorted to hybrid warfare, such as what happened in Crimea in 2014. So we had expected that we would see increasing number of cyber attacks on Ukraine if Russia would start aggressions against Ukraine. But you know what? Of course, the cyber attacks on Ukraine's government and military sites increased by 196%, or almost twice, for the first 3 days after the aggressions. But it was also only twice as much. And cyber attacks, on the other hand, the cyber attacks on Russian organizations increased only by 4%. So we wonder why only 196%? And why we haven't seen aggressive and disruptive nature of cyber attacks against the Ukrainian critical infrastructure sectors, especially communications, because that was what the Russia targeted first during its 2014 operations. So there are potential reasons why Russia avoided to do so, according to Washington Post recent article. So first reason is that Russia had expected that Ukrainian side would succumb quickly if Russia would start military aggression. So Russia really wanted to keep the Ukrainian communications and other critical infrastructure services alive so that it would be easier and more convenient for the Russians after the occupation. The second reason, potential reason why, is that the Russians also needed to keep Ukrainian communication services alive to launch their own cyber espionage. Because during wartime, any actor needs to access accurate and also prompt good intelligence all the time. And if all the communication services die, then any country would also lose one of the crucial ways to collect good intelligence. So this is the second reason why Russia might have avoided to target massively the Ukrainian communication service. Of course, these are the only hypothetical scenarios, and nobody knows why we haven't seen what we had expected to see after the aggression. And aside from state to state and military to military, and also the non-state actors and cyber attacks, we've seen opportunistic, financially motivated cyber attacks associated with Ukraine-Russia situation. So we've already seen the donation scams to persuade goodwill peoples to donate monies to help freeing Ukrainians from their own country to other European countries, impersonating even the Ukrainian government or UNICEF. And we've seen, because we are also very worried about what will happen to our supply chains after the aggressions, the scale of the Russian aggressions expands in the Black Sea. So the financially motivated and cyber criminals took advantage of our fear to the disruptions of our supply chain. So they started to launch a phishing email attacks to looking like a questionnaire on how the companies have been preparing for supply chain risk management. And of course, the attachment of the code questionnaire is not a questionnaire. It is actually a computer virus infect the computer systems. And another really the malicious ways to exploit your trust is the phishing campaign to target European governmental officials who are helping the logistics of refugees fleeing from Ukraine. So immediately after the Russian aggressions, we started to see that state-sponsored actors started to target personal email addresses of Ukrainian military officers, because personal email addresses are less protected well for cybersecurity than the official email addresses. And seems like this phishing email campaign are already using the exploited Ukrainian government officials' personal email address so that they can send impersonated Ukrainian government emails to European government officers to try to find out the intelligence and how European countries are helping the refugees from Ukraine. And another scenario we've been really worried about, and yet we haven't seen much yet, is ransomware attacks. So ransomware attacks in this case can be used for two purposes. So one is to launch a retaliatory cyber attack against countries that imposed economic sanctions on Russia, or to use ransomware attacks to obtain foreign currencies or money or cryptocurrencies to evade economic sanctions. And we have to also be aware that the number of detected ransomware attacks have been increased significantly over the last 2 years during the COVID-19 pandemic. Why? Because we've been more reliant on IT systems or the internet more than ever. And we've been talking to each other through Zoom or Teams or WebEx almost on a daily basis. And it is almost impossible for us to patch our vulnerabilities in our IT assets on a timely manner. So that is why the cyber attackers already know what they should go after, because it is impossible for us to secure our systems entirely. And unfortunately, Japan started to see some major ransomware attacks over the last couple of weeks. And as we've already seen after the Colonial Pipeline incident or JBS meat producer incident in May 2021 by massive ransomware attacks, even one financially motivated cyber criminal group can cause massive disruptions to our supply chain. So I've already seen concerned voices from customers and suppliers, because it is really challenging for them to protect ensure cybersecurity for their entire supply chain, given that the supply chains are so complicated and massive to cover all of the world. And even though that major companies as customers really wants to impose good cybersecurity practices and manage supply chain risks, they can only do the first layer of their supply chain. But if they are big enough, they would have the second layers, third layers, fourth layers, or 10th layers. And it is impossible for us to reach out to the second, third, fourth, or 10th supply chain layer. So we have to have sector-based or nation-based standardizations to do supply chain risk management for better security. And also suppliers are getting so confused because big companies that are really cybersecurity savvy and worried about their cybersecurity and supply chain risk management started to ask for different cybersecurity measures to take, but it's impossible for small and medium-sized companies to do everything and purchase all of the available cybersecurity services or products. So here's a list of what we need to do. So we have to have a sector-based supply chain or cybersecurity standards so that we would have less confusion about supply chain risk management. And the Nagoya Chamber of Commerce did a little survey back in December 2018. And the Japanese government has issued 5 basic principles for small and medium-sized companies should implement in terms of cybersecurity, such as use good passwords, use antivirus software, and know how your IT systems are configured. Sounds really basic and easy to implement, but you know what? After the Nagoya Chamber of Commerce did this survey, they found out that only 10% of their small and medium-sized companies members practice all the 5 basic cybersecurity practices. So it also means that we have a big chance to win because we have so much room to grow and raise cybersecurity awareness among small and medium-sized companies. And Tokyo metropolitan government has already started to implement really interesting and good cybersecurity practices because they're big enough to support small and medium-sized companies to provide monies to invest in cybersecurity services or products. And also they started to distribute cybersecurity manga brochure to break down the concept of technical concept of cyber attacks and what kind of and also reasonable cybersecurity measures that even small and medium-sized companies are expected to take. And I think this is a great opportunity for Japan to start sharing our lessons learned from Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Even though that the Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games had been was hit by a massive number of cyber attacks, actually twice as many as the London 2012 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games had encountered. Japan was able to protect the operations of Tokyo 2020 from any disruptions to the operations.
Thank you. Excuse me, Miroku, can you please sum up until your conclusion? Because we need again to listen to the presentation by Nicolas. So maybe we could come back later to some of your points, sure, if you may. So thank you very much.
Sure. So Japan has now the best practices to offer to the rest of the world. And I find that the world is now more worried about cybersecurity and cyber attacks more than ever. And now we've seen during this Ukraine situation, the non-governmental hacker groups can get into to complicate the situation more. So we have to reinvent and reform the international cybersecurity norms. And cybersecurity is really difficult, and it's like a marathon, not a sprint. So stress management and supply chain risk management are crucial to do better for global and also national level of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm sure we will come back later to what you said. And now I give directly the floor to Nicolas for 15 minutes. And we will have 15 minutes more for Q&A. Thank you very much, Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Miyoko. I will try to sum up my presentation in order to give the most important time possible for the Q&A session. And as it is the tradition now for this webinar, I won't use any slide as a French presenter. So many thanks, Miyoko, for all the insights you gave us about the global situation, the global trends, and also the Ukraine situation. It will be very helpful for me in order to discuss all of these elements. Well, as you mentioned, in terms of trends in cyber nowadays, but it's not a 2022 trend. It's starting from nearly 5 to 10 years. We are experiencing a global switch from IT-based cyber attacks to OT-based cyber attacks. And more, we're experiencing cyber attacks that are targeting operational technology, industrial control systems, more than bureaucratics and information technology for a series of reasons. First of all, is that if you want to have a major impact on a country, if you want to have a major impact on a company, it's whether more interesting to target this operational technology, these industrial control systems, because it's where the impact is the most important. And it could be, we'll jump to this point later about Ukraine, but it could be also very important in terms of hybrid warfare or in terms of global cyber conflicts. Another reason why we're experiencing this switch from IT to OT, it's because of cybersecurity globally. Well, it's the elephant in the room when discussing about the cybersecurity of operational technology, but most of the time, the cyber technology of industrial control system is considered a non-priority issue in terms of industrial control system, because it's very hard to patch these elements. It's harder, way harder to patch this system than to patch IT systems. And most of them in 2022 have not been conceived in security by design. And that's a major point, a major issue. And as more and more industrial systems are connected to the cyberspace or connected to have remote control action, it increases the surface of attack possible for attackers that may be cyber criminals or maybe hybrid threats, non-state actors, or state actors hiding behind another identity. So that's the major issue I wanted to highlight, with also this idea Miyoko discussed minutes before of the whole supply chain issue. We're also experiencing that the attacks are not nowadays targeting the core target, but are oriented towards second layer, third layer, fourth layer, etc., suppliers that may be less protected than the target you really want to disable, or where you really want to steal information. So the colonial pipeline issue also reminding that even if there are this issue of IT versus OT cyber attacks, an attack on IT, because on the colonial pipeline, it was an attack on the IT, on the bureaucratics of the company, can have major impacts on the operational technology. It was not an attack on OT, but the company has to disconnect the pipeline system and stop it from running. So looking at the different insights we can pull out from these elements is that, first of all, I know it's a very well-known issue about cybersecurity, and Miyoko also mentioned, for example, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government strategy to raise awareness, but we have to discuss, and we have to also discuss about this issue, is that awareness, preparation, education are the major issues in order to strengthen cybersecurity. For example, we also discussed about the phishing campaigns, but when you have an operational technology, so an industrial control system running with only a password-based cybersecurity, it's very easy to steal the password through a phishing campaign. And when you're aware of this situation, it's also that easy to switch from this simple, unique password-based cybersecurity to a two-factor authentication system. And when you have a two-factor authentication, even if your password is still, the attacker cannot enter your system and cannot paralyze your whole infrastructure. So it can be very easy, and it's a matter of education. It's a matter of hygiene in terms of cyber. So to discuss a little bit in deep from the French and European side about this issue, when you're looking at what the European Union, for example, is doing in terms of cybersecurity, European Union nowadays is in the middle of discussing major text and major laws in terms of cybersecurity and global in terms of security. We're in the middle of the European Union of the discussion, complement the first NIS, so Network and Information Security Directive, strengthening the obligations in terms of cybersecurity for critical operators and creating another layer of critical operators that are not only critical operators for a single country, but are critical operators that are operating a facility in multiple European countries, or creating a new layer of constraints and a new layer of cybersecurity requirements for these operators. What's very interesting is that this NIS2 directive is also developed to work with another directive, which is the CER directive, so Critical Entities Resilience Directive, that is focused on resilience for non-cyber issues. So there are really the two legs of a global strategy for the European Union to strengthen the critical operators' security, especially directed towards hybrid threats, with the NIS for all, the NIS2 for the whole cyber issues, and the CER for the whole non-cyber issues. The problem is that discussing about this idea of value chain and supply chain attacks is at the European level, and then at the member states level also. Most of the time the cybersecurity is designed around this idea of critical operators. And the problem is that if you're not a critical operator, the requirement for cybersecurity could be far lower than they are, considering this NIS and in the next year NIS2 directive. And that could be an important issue because you may have important actors managing critical facilities that are not considered critical operators, and in terms of value chain, in terms of a second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. rounds of suppliers, they can create breaches and create access to critical operators' network systems, and that could be a major issue. Some kind of facilities are not considered critical, but are very fragile in terms of security. I'm thinking about, for example, the wind turbines and wind farms that are more and more targeted specifically by cyber attacks, and that could be very dramatic in terms of consequences. The second trend at the French level and in terms of cyber defense, so at the military level, is that French also released in late 2021 the third part of its global doctrine for cyber element. That's the doctrine targeting not the defensive, not the offensive cyber, but the computer-based influence in cyber. And that's very interesting to understand that more and more these cyber security and cyber defense issues are oriented not only towards technical aspects, but more and more also towards information aspects, with the need to link, of course, the two elements. Then it helps me to jump to the Ukraine-Russia issue and to build also on what Miroku said a little earlier, is that, in my opinion, it's very interesting to understand that we are no more in 2014. In 2014, the Russian attack was nearly some kind of surprise attack. It was the by-the-book hybrid threat with the little green man, you all remember. But this time it was not. It was not because it was not a quasi-surprise attack, as it has been in 2014. So the Ukrainian was particularly aware, and also the Ukrainians, with support of the European Union and with support of NATO. And it's very important to understand the time span between 2014 and 2022, what happened. The Ukrainians strengthened their cyber security. developed cybersecurity measures, invested in cybersecurity, raised awareness in cybersecurity due to their cooperation with NATO and with the European Union. And to me, it's also an explanation on why, even with the important increase in terms of cybersecurity targeted Ukraine, we, for the moment, didn't experience the same level of aggression by Russia. Remember the 2015 Black Energy cyber attack. We did not have the equivalent this time, whereas it should have been, militarily speaking, very interesting for Russia to target directly the electricity distribution operator system and to put the whole Ukraine in blackout. So it was not the case because, in my opinion, there was a better awareness and better level of cybersecurity. And to my opinion also, it's the same in terms of influence and computer-based influence. This time, the Russian campaign of influence and computer-based influence was not that successful also because the Ukrainians had the time to prepare themselves and at the time to also create their own Stratcom and to avoid Russian deception maneuvers. And this time, when looking at what's happening, for example, in the European and the whole Western media, it's more the Ukrainians that are creating a campaign of Stratcom than the Russians that are pushing their own elements. So that leaves a large number of doors open to discuss this issue of cyber in Ukraine. But just to conclude, and Valérie, you will like this conclusion because I will try to link maritime, space, and cyber aspects. I think that the most important trend for the future now is the issue of cyber infrastructure. With the 5G and with the important rush of China in 5G, Western and Japanese were totally overwhelmed by this Chinese technology because of our own lack of investment and our own lack of awareness, whether the United States, Europe, Japan, etc. It's not that China was so powerful in terms of R&D, it's that we stopped from investing the necessary amounts of money and of manpower in terms of infrastructure. But now it's changing. It's changing in the United States, for example, with the Next G Alliance that's working also with US, Japan, and US-EU agreements in order to develop the post-5G technology. Unfortunately, in the European Union, even if we're aware of this issue, the level of investment is not that important. The most important part in Europe is a research consortium under financing of the European Commission called EXA-X, that's mostly oriented towards EU, even if there are a few international partners. And this issue of the post-5G will not be only an issue of communication. It will be an issue of linking the communication with space, with low Earth orbit constellation, in which China, in which the United States are investing very, some with dual purpose technology, especially the Hongyang constellation from CSC in China, but also in the maritime aspect, because France also released a few weeks ago its seabed warfare strategy, and there are this issue about the maritime aspects of communication of cyber with, of course, the subsea cables and the development of subsea cables, where there also, as in space, as in cyber, even if we did not discuss this issue in cyber, as in maritime, the US-China competition is becoming more and more the strategic landscape and the major strategic landscape for tomorrow. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, do not hesitate.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicolas, for sticking to your 15 minutes. It leaves us with 15 minutes for Q&A. So I will immediately refer to the Q&A questions we received. First, because it will be interesting to have the position of our speakers on these questions. First, there is a question to both, I think, Admiral Koda and Marianne, about do you think that it's a little, you know, do you think that China might take opportunity and advantage of the fact that the US are, again, you know, focused on what is going on in Europe, in order to increase its operation in East or South China Sea and the Pacific, And what about these joint operations that we saw recently around Japan between China and Russia? So Admiral Koda, if you want to give us a few words on this, on Marianne also. I have 6 questions, so please, 15 minutes, so please, yeah, keep that in mind, please.
Oh,
So
yes,
maybe,
you know,
yeah.
Yeah, there are many opinions or speculations about China might take an advantage of the chaotic situation in Ukraine, or the other way of saying is US would be tethered to the Ukraine issue. But you know, reality is US Indo-PACOM is independent, and US does not make the huge military forces shift from Indo-Pacific to Europe. So situation in this area is pretty stable, and Chinese, you know, the adventurism, at least visible, and the adventurism is pretty well, you know, suppressed by the US presence. But still, you know, one thing we have to pay attention is like the cyber. You know, China is taking every opportunity to increase its, you know, the soft power, the influence capability in this region, and expanding to the outward, and even the Pacific Islands in both in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So those are the areas we need to pay attention. But you know, if that question is to the kind of the immediate events, you know, the US PACOM is pretty well prepared, and I think they are acting and maneuvering appropriately. Thank you.
Marianne, do you want to have the few words?
Yes, I will really echo what Admiral Koda said. This is, you see, the traditional question regarding the two crisis theater capability and management, and this is not new. And what we all know is that Indo-Pacific is a priority for US. They had a very, very strong military print in the area, and they are very, very well prepared to react in any way, in any kind of scenario. And I will insist on the fact that they made quite a very specific, I will say, evolution recently regarding the partnership and alliance by trying to reinforce the Quad, enlarging the scope of the Quad on, I will say, global security issue, including the maritime, of course. But of course, we all have in mind this new kind of partnership, which is the AUKUS, with this specific focus on operational relation and high technology sharing, including, of course, intelligence sharing. So this priority that is on the Indo-Pacific theater from US is really something which is, I will say, a permanent parameter that we had to keep in mind. And also the fact is that military option is not the option you see putting in place when it came to managing the situation in Ukraine. We are seeing transfer of military equipment and of course reinsurance regarding, you see, the NATO partner. But strictly speaking, US is not engaging in the crisis, military speaking for now.
Thank you very much. So now I have another question concerning space. To Kazuto, Suzuki, and Xavier also maybe. How do you see more precisely, it's to me very technical, but recent attacks or ongoing attacks against SATCOM terminals? How do you say terminal? It's in French, the question. So in Europe. Can you comment on that or?
Right. It seems that there are reports on the attack on the service of the satellite through Viasat. and that is basically a DDoS attack. So it seems that it's not really the sort of a state-organized attack. It's more like, I don't know for what reasons they do, but it's not targeting the military satellite. It's the Viasat is basically the commercial satellite. So I don't know why it happens. It's just for the disruption of the communication in general. But it seems that the situation is not that disrupted. I think it's in a similar case of cyber. I think Mihoko has mentioned that there was not much of the cyber disruptive activities, and I think as far as we can see, the space is still working, and there are very limited reports on the attack on the satellites and the satellite-derived services. So it seems that even though there are attacks, but I don't think that there's any effective damages occurred in the military operations or civilian services.
Xavier, do you have something to add to this?
Yes, very quickly to complement what Kazuto has just said. Yeah, I think it's an attack perpetrated against the KA sat, which is an internet satellite. This is something that's been used. It's been launched by Eutelsat a few years ago, and it's now been transferred to Viasat. And in fact, you're using this satellite basically to access the internet and have a satellite access to the internet. So it seems like Ukraine was using this, at some point. It has a few customership. It's not so big. I mean, in France, a number of subscribers to this service have been something like 10,000 subscribers have been prevented from using it because of this attack. It's not clear, as Kazuto said, if it was mostly a military-oriented kind of action or if it's something larger than that. And beyond this, of course, it looks like, by the way, that observers of satellite activities in space don't detect any, so far, strange moves, etc. There's no report about developing situation in space, let's say. Even if we can see some Russian satellites, getting closer to the low Earth orbit, etc. But there's no real, not yet, and we cross fingers, no real development space at this point. There is the usual jamming. This is clearly something that happened in any event, military event, on a theater of operations, etc. That's happening with the GPS, with all these things. But this is, I would say, rather classical. We don't see, so to my knowledge, at the moment, we don't see specific activities in space, that would derive from the Ukrainian operation.
Thank you. And now I have a question of my own, maybe very naive. It's to Mihoko and Nicolas. We speak a lot, of course, about energy issues and security and so on. So I think I remember that there are pipelines. Of course, we discussed a lot about the Nord Stream, but there is also a pipeline going across Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. What about this? I was very surprised that nobody is mentioning that, the security of that pipe, no risk of sabotage, nobody wants to just destroy it or whatever. So, and also the vulnerability to attacks, including cyber attacks against the management of that crucial pipeline going through Ukraine, a country at war, actually. So maybe Nicolas wants to begin, and then Mihoko can add one word.
Well, let's go. Well, of course, Valerie, it's not one pipeline by itself. It's more a network of pipeline, mostly oil and gas pipelines, and oil being oil and oil products. So you have a whole network of pipeline going through Ukraine. Well, to what I know, there are no specific attacks on pipeline because these pipelines are used to transport Russian, and not only Russian, also Central Asian, oil and gas to Europe. So there is no need for the Russians to attack this pipeline, but also there is no need for the Ukrainians to target their own infrastructure. So for the moment, it's a situation where nobody wants to target this kind of infrastructure. Also because that's a global point about this situation between Ukraine and Russia, and globally between Russia and Western countries, because energy is the major negotiation channel. And if you stop having the energy as a negotiation channel, especially, for example, if tomorrow you have sanctions from the US or from the European Union explaining that now we don't import any more oil and gas from Russia, you lower the capability to influence and to go into negotiations with Russia. So it's very important to maintain this kind of capabilities open because they are also useful for negotiations. Well, in terms of cybersecurity, and I will let the floor to Miyoko, it was, I mentioned, about the strengthening of regulation towards cybersecurity in the European Union, but also the cooperation between the Ukrainian authorities, NATO, and the EU to strengthen their own cybersecurity, as pipeline is considered as a very important critical asset, as well as nuclear power plants. For example, you may have exactly the same question about the nuclear power plants of Ukraine. And you have international regulation, you have international cooperation in order to strengthen this level of cybersecurity. And this kind of infrastructure are among the most protected in terms of cybersecurity in the world, because they are critical, and because if there is a major issue, it can have an immediate impact of the population way over the territory of Ukraine.
Thank you. Miyoko, do you want to add a word to that question?
Thank you, Nicola, for sharing the valuable insights. So if you really want to destroy a facility of critical infrastructure, including energy pipeline, and for military reasons, now you have two choices. And one, you can use missiles or kinetic means to destroy it quickly, and you can also use a cyber attack. But to launch a cyber attack, it will take time to do espionage, and it will take a long time. And if Russia would want to do that kind of measures to take, then they should have been able to do it for a really long time, to do the necessary espionage, to implant computer BIOS to make it work. So, and also then they also have to be considerate about energy negotiations with European countries and also the United States. So for all of those reasons, I'm not sure if attacking a pipeline would be plausible options to take in this situation.
Thank you very much. So I'm afraid it will be the last question, but I think it is an interesting one. Again, to Admiral Koda and maybe Marianne also, is what about, it's a question concerning the joint exercise between Japan and France and in multilateral format. And the question is how interoperable are French and Japanese navies? And this is important because we are more and more involved in missions in the framework of Indo-Pacific, and what are the prospects of their bilateral cooperation materializing? Admiral Koda, do you have something to say about that?
Yes, actually, when I was a senior staff in charge of the plans, policy, strategy, and operations in 2001-2003 period, I was the first Japanese admiral who visited the Tahiti French Pacific Command. And then we started the real exchanges. So, we do want, but the key problem is that the size of the French force there is fairly small. And French has French own requirement. No, but key is 2 ships. But every year, every 2 years, French send 1 to the South China Sea. And next year, 1 to the Northwestern Atlantic and the Pacific. So, I think the up-tempo of French ship, 2 ships, are a little too busy to conduct the real, the high-end, the bilateral operations. And also due to the wild Chinese and the North Korean, our ships are becoming also too busy. So now the opportunity in recent years, is fairly limited. That's why, we try to put as many nations as possible to make the exercise as big and multinational. So that is the current trend. But still there is a chance, and maybe some point in the future, like the last year, if the French Navy deployed nuclear submarine to this area with a longer range, and that's a good opportunity for us. Or maybe the Charles de Gaulle, too busy. Let's say they're hypothetical. So there will be some chances. And another arena is Indian Ocean. Japanese one ships normally, the 1+ ships in the Indian Ocean. So that's another opportunity, much closer to the Indian fleet and also the Europe. So that would provide another opportunities to do. But the interoperability is, of course, far better than the average. So both are in the NATO standard. Japan operate under the NATO tactics. So basically, they are much in common. So I do not worry about that area, interoperability. Of course, the language is different. So French sailors should learn some Japanese, and we have to learn some French. That's it. Thank you.
Yes, a good recipe for mishaps, I'm afraid, Sherry. Okay, so Maria, do you want to add something to that?
No, it's true that
we will conclude, and you have the concluding words because we are just
tonight. Yeah, no, just to say that indeed the lack of maritime platform is a main obstacle. You see to go to a deeper, I will say, training knowledge and habits of training and exercises together. But as you mentioned, exchange of operational officer, exchange of best practice, tabletop exercise can help. And above all, the fact that the Japanese Navy is working with US through some NATO standard is of course very helping because the French Navy is operating through this NATO standard. So I think it is the best way. And I will stop there. And I know that a lot of attention is attracted to the maritime theater of Ukraine and what is going on and what could be the transposition regarding the use of force of any eventual scenario used by China regarding the Taiwan Strait. We are fully aware of that, and we are following the situation, maybe with less concern than Japan, which has very strange and turbulent neighbor. But we are part of the Indo-Pacific, and we feel totally, I will say, embedded in this kind of maritime security concern.
Okay, so thank you very much to all of you. Next time, I think we will need a little bit more time for Q&A because not all of them have been addressed. I'm sorry about that, but it has been extremely informative, I think, as usual. And I look forward to seeing you again. And I hope in Paris next time. So
sure.
We could organize a conference in Paris. It will be a good thing to do. So thank you very much and see you again soon. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you to all.